May the spirit of wisdom and mercy grow and blossom in all of us. Please be seated. I welcome you to this academic session on the occasion of the public defense of the dissertation, Is the Voice of a Woman Shameful? A linguistic anthropological study of the multinormativity of Jordan's society, written by Martin Kurani. The committee, which will be present through the screen, consists of Professor Buitelaar of Groningen University, Professor van Nieuwkerk of Radboud University Nijmegen, Dr. Wagemakers of Utrecht University, and Professor Backus of Tilburg University. The supervisors, most far away is Professor Beck of this university, and co-supervisor Dr. J.M.E de Ruiter. There was also Jan Blommaert, another professor of this university, who was supervisor, but sadly enough we lost him 2 months ago. But anyhow, he is clearly one of the moving spirits behind the project, it seems to me. Before we start the defense, I would like to give the PhD candidate the floor to give a summary of his research in terms that can be understood by me and others in the general public.
Thank you. Highly esteemed supervisors, highly esteemed opponents, ladies and gentlemen. Before I start with my presentation, let me read the quote from my dedication page, which I put there in memory of Jan Blommaert. What we have once enjoyed deeply, we can never lose. All that we lose deeply, all we that love deeply becomes a part of us. Jan, in his last email to me, promised that he would be watching this with a broad smile. I guess he doesn't need a Zoom link anymore. Allow me to start by unpacking the subtitle. Each society has not just many norms, it has also many kind of different norms. And this plurality of normative systems is what the dissertation calls multinormativity. The dissertation is also a linguistic anthropological study, which basically gives special attention to language and how it shapes society and culture, and vice versa. For example, there are 3 words in colloquial Arabic, which are aib, shame, haram, taboo, and mamnua, which index illicit behavior. The first round of interviews took these words and asked people about the usage of these words, and then analyzed it and tried to gain some insight into the multinormativity of Jordan's society. During that phase already, it became clear that in order to avoid a snapshot version of the image of the society, it would be useful to have a second round of interviews which focuses more on historical developments and recent decades. The second round used historic pictures to jog people's memory. And because it uses pictures and focuses also on certain symbols and things like the hijab and other things, it widens also a bit the whole scope of the study from linguistic into a semiotic perspective. This brings me to the next point. The title contains the word voice because the dissertation is concerned about and interested in discourse analysis. However, it uses the word voice embedded in Blommaert's definition of discourse. He writes, discourse to me comprises all forms of meaningful semiotic human activity seen in connection with social, cultural, and historical patterns in developments of use. Now, from this perspective, voice is not just the ability to produce some verbal utterances, but it also entails having the opportunity to express oneself, which is number 2 here. Further, it is necessary to have a certain to be taken serious in a group, to have a certain standing in a group, number 3. And finally, one must also be allowed to deviate at least to a certain degree from the norms to be able to renegotiate norms and to join into shaping the society and its norms. Although the dissertation does not limit itself to a linguistic perspective, which a big chunk of critical discourse analysis does, it does share its interest, as described here by Van Dijk. Critical discourse analysis focuses on social problems, and especially on the role of discourse in the production and reproduction of power, abuse, or domination. Wherever possible, it does so from a perspective that is consistent with the best interests of dominated groups. Although the title indicates already that the dominated group here would be women, the whole study was not conceived as a study or research in the field of gender studies. Actually, the first 3 interviews started off by asking basically only, is there a difference between aib, haram, and mamnua, and what is it? But those interviews were already so insightful, or gave so much insight, were so informative, and that they emphasized 2 things which subsequent interviews have been confirming time and again. First, the informant said, the aib is the most dominant normative code in everyday life, clearly outweighing the importance of religion and state. Second, that aib is disproportionately concerned with regimenting female behavior. The brevity of time prevents me from sharing much about the methodological aspects of the research. Only a few basic facts here. Both rounds of interviews together contain 39 semi-structured interviews with 48 informants. Now, on the second slide, you can see participants' age, sex, coded according to different interviews. We have 26 women, 22 men from all walks of life, 31 living in Amman, 17 outside of Amman. Allow me to turn to the findings. First, there is a clear correlation between certain words and specific normative codes. Haram almost exclusively refers to norms from the religious realm. Aib refers to customary codes. A synonym for aib would be the people talk, nas btahki. And mamnua could be sometimes used as a hypernym, basically covering all kinds of different things forbidden by any kind of authority, but at certain times it's also referred or directly to legal norms given by the state. A comparison of the field structures shows that haram and mamnua, in meaning law, are homologous in the sense of Bourdieu, that they're very similar. They have written texts, official institutions, trained experts, all that aib does not have. Aib actually seems more like an aesthetic category, which points to something which diminishes a person's attractiveness, especially on the marriage market. This also shows that aib is completely different in the way it shapes or it interacts with society and it's negotiated. Another findings are that aib limits women much more than haram or the legal code or the religious code in their mobility, their dress code, their social interaction. And there are very few aib limitations for men, but the effects are very different for men and women. There are 2 sayings in Judaic Arabic which show that. One is which means a man is not shamed by shame. Well, marazil gazas, a woman is like glass, meaning once it's broken, you can't fix it. And it shows that if a man does something contrary to the aib code, he oftentimes is easily forgiven. A woman might never outlive the consequences. Oops. Not only is ape more dominant in the society as a whole, but the legal aspect, the legal norm seems to be almost non-existent with informants outside of Amman. The data gathered gives the impression that outside of Amman, people only rarely ever use the state to think about illicit behavior at all. The dissertation suggests that this might be connected somehow to the fact that Jordan, for a long time, was part of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans ruled in Jordan since the beginning of the 16th century, but they never actually, or rarely ever, really exerted real authority or ruled the country. It was oftentimes only nominally. There was the millet system. And so for centuries, people actually were expected, in a way, to rule themselves. And it seems that the rural population, until today in Jordan, the habitus of the rural population has not changed very much in this regard. One of the informants agreed that ape was very, very dominant, absolutely dominant actually, in an earlier time when her father was still younger, she says. But nowadays that haram and religious normative codes have taken over. Now, there's no denying that certain symbols and practices from the religious realm have increased dramatically in the last 30, 40 years. But there is also, one must not forget that there was another big transition, big change in the 20th century, when quite a considerable part of the society abandoned the traditional, as you can see here on the right side. The older lady has traditional clothes, and the next generation is completely different. At that time, when this happened, when people started dropping all those traditional clothes, ape didn't go away. Ape was very strong, alive and kicking. It only changed what was ape. And I think in that sense, one could suggest that also now there is a change, but it doesn't necessarily mean that ape has gone away. There's a massive change, or massive things have happened in the second half of the 20th century, big challenges for the society. There's more anonymity and sexual harassment in the street. Co-educational practices at schools have been introduced on a broad scale. And there are many, many places like cafes, shopping malls and things which have not existed before, where women, younger and older women now, are exposed or meet men not from their family. And it seems that quite a considerable amount of women have adopted what some really call a new fashion, like the hijab, have adopted this because it somehow was a sensible way to deal and to respond to the many different developments and forces of the society. So let me return to the title. Is the voice of a woman shameful? Particularly from a perspective, the answer must be yes. In all four aspects, actually the code has limited or is limiting severely women and how they can express themselves. From a religious perspective, one could say that certain things are what they call aura. It is forbidden by a certain perspective of Islam or Islamic interpretation. You should not show your hair or other things, so there's a limit. Also, the whole male guardianship poses some limitations on women, but it would be not fair to say that actually, from the perspective of the Muslim perspective of the informants, that the voice of a woman is actually shameful. Quite the opposite. Several female informants who are committed Muslims and study their religion and exemplify its virtues are also women who use Islam in order to be active, to shape their society and to have an authentic voice in the community. In other words, some women used symbolic capital which they were able to acquire by living up to Islamic standards to gain a voice and to overcome the limits posed by the Ape Code. Further studies could investigate to what degree this approach allows women to erase any form of symbolic violence and inequality, or ultimately poses just merely a higher ceiling, but a ceiling nevertheless. Thank you very much for your attention.